The rifle was already in Effie Garner's hands when Albert Malone came riding up her drive for the fourth time that week, and this time she had decided she was going to use it. "You turn that horse around right now," she called out from the porch, her voice steady in a way her heart was not. The late afternoon sun was bleeding orange and red across the flat Texas plain, and it painted Albert Malone in shades of fire which felt appropriate. He was a fire. He had been burning her alive since the moment she set foot on this land. He pulled his bay gelding to a stop 20 feet from her porch steps and did not raise his hands, did not flinch, did not do a single sensible thing a man should do when a widow with grief still fresh in her eyes points a Winchester at him. He just looked at her. That dark, steady look that made her feel seen in ways she had not asked to be seen. "I know about the deed, Effie," he said. Those 5 words hit her like a fist to the sternum. She had not told a soul. Not one living person in the town of Caldwell, Kansas knew what she had discovered 3 nights ago by candlelight when she finally had the courage to pull open the strongbox that had belonged to her late husband, Franklin Garner. She had not told the land office. She had not told her only neighbor, old Mrs. Beaumont 2 miles west. She had told no one because what was in that strongbox was dangerous, and what it meant for this small parcel of land she had purchased with every last cent she owned was something that could ruin her completely. "You do not know anything," she said. Her finger tightened on the trigger guard. "I know enough." He swung down from his horse in one easy motion, boots hitting the dry Kansas dirt, and he stood there holding his reins, not advancing, not retreating. "And I know that the man who wants that deed back is coming for it. He is already in town, rode in this afternoon on the stage." The rifle wavered, just slightly, just enough for Albert Malone to see it, and she hated him for seeing it. "You need to let me help you," he said. And that was when Effie Garner, 31 years old, 7 months a widow, owner of 12 acres of Kansas plains that apparently held a secret that could get her killed, realized she was in far more trouble than she had let herself believe. She lowered the rifle 2 inches. It was not surrender. It was the beginning of something she could not yet name. The way Effie had come to own those 12 acres of Sumner County, Kansas began the way most desperate things begin, with a woman who had no other choice and a sum of money that was almost not enough. Franklin Garner had died in the spring of 1882 in the city of Wichita from a fever that took him in 4 days. They had been married 9 years, and it had been a decent marriage, the kind built on mutual respect and shared practical aims rather than any blazing passion. Franklin was a bookkeeper by trade, a quiet man, steady and deliberate, and Effie had loved him in the manner of someone who knows they are fortunate and does not take fortune for granted. What she had not known, not until she sat in the lawyer's office on a Thursday afternoon in April with dust motes floating in the dry air, and a man named Hiram Cross reading from papers in a flat, unaffected voice, was that Franklin had debts. Large ones. The kind of debts that consumed every asset a man possessed down to his pocket watch, and the spare boots in his wardrobe. Effie had walked out of that lawyer's office with $47 and a steamer trunk of personal effects, and she had stood on the wooden sidewalk of Wichita while the world moved around her, and she understood, with the quiet, terrible clarity that only true desperation brings, that she was completely alone. She had no family. Her mother had died when Effie was 12, her father 2 years later. She had a distant cousin in Missouri she had not seen since childhood. She had skills because Effie Garner had always been the kind of woman who made herself useful. She could cook, sew, preserve, garden, keep accounts. She had helped Franklin with his books for years. But none of those skills were the kind that translated to a wage in a city where she was known as nothing but a bookkeeper's widow. For 6 weeks she had lived in a boarding house on Wichita's less fashionable east side, taking in mending and copying letters for $1 a week, and she had spent those 6 weeks thinking, calculating, looking at the world with the precise, unsentimental eye she had always possessed, and she had concluded that what she needed was land, not because she knew anything about farming. Not because she had some romantic notion of the frontier, but because land was the one thing that did not disappear when a man died and left you nothing. Land was permanent. Land was yours. She had found the listing through a land broker who operated out of a cramped office near the rail depot. 12 acres in Sumner County, about 18 miles east of Caldwell, which sat right on the Kansas-Oklahoma border and was, in those years, one of the most lively and occasionally dangerous cattle towns on the Kishom Trail. The 12 acres had a small house on them, more honestly described as a large shack, and a hand-dug well, and a barn with one rotted wall. The asking price was $42. She bought it with $40 of her $47, loaded her steamer trunk into a wagon she hired with the remaining $7, and drove herself out to the property on a morning in late May when the Kansas wind was warm and the prairie grass was the most vivid, startling green she had ever seen. She stood on the porch of that shack and looked at the flat horizon in every direction and thought, "This is mine. Whatever comes next, this is mine." She had no idea then that the land held a secret. That Franklin had been involved in something he had never told her about. That the strongbox she had packed without opening, because grief makes you do things without thinking, contained documents that would upend everything she thought she understood about her quiet, steady, deliberate dead husband. And she had no idea then that the man who owned the 360 acres to her north, the man whose cattle grazed the ridge she could see from her kitchen window, the man whose cowboys occasionally rode along her fence line with curious eyes, would become the most complicated, most infuriating, most necessary person in her life. Albert Malone had been ranching the Sumner County plains for 6 years when Effie Garner arrived at the small parcel of land directly adjacent to his south pasture. He had come to Kansas from Missouri at the age of 24 with a modest inheritance from his father, enough money to put down on land and buy a modest starter herd. He was 30 years old now, and the Triple M Ranch, as he had named it with perhaps more ambition than the 3 modest initials deserved, had grown into something real. Something he had built with his hands and his back, and a stubbornness that his foreman, a weathered man named Pete Hollis, frequently described as the most alarming personality trait Albert possessed. He was not a man who frightened easily. He had weathered drought and blizzard and cattle prices that crashed and recovered and crashed again. He had navigated the lawless energy of being near Caldwell in its wildest years, when the cattle drives came up from Texas, and the town filled with cowboys with money and whiskey and guns. He had dealt with rustlers twice, and both times he had handled it without involving the law because the law in Sumner County in 1882 was still a loosely organized concept. He was not a man who paid much attention to his neighbors either. There had been a family to the south before, the Hennessy family, who had farmed the 12 acres and then failed and left, as people often did. He had expected whoever bought the land next to be a similar story, a hopeful homesteader who would last 2 seasons and move on. When Pete Hollis rode in from the south pasture on a Tuesday afternoon in late May and reported that the new owner of the 12 acres was a woman, alone, driving a wagon loaded with a single trunk, Albert Malone had felt the first flicker of something that was not quite concern and not quite curiosity, but something uncomfortably close to both. "She buy it outright?" he asked. "Deed says so, according to what Hector heard in town," Pete said, helping himself to coffee. "Widow out of Wichita. Name's Garner." Albert had ridden out to the fence line that afternoon, telling himself he was checking the wire after the last big wind. He could see the small house from the high point of his south pasture, and he could see, at that distance, a figure in a gray dress hauling buckets from the well, methodical and unhurried in the work. He had told himself it was his duty as a neighbor to ride over and introduce himself. He had also told himself that, and not entirely believed it. He first met her 2 days after she arrived, when he rode over on the pretext of offering the use of his extra mule for any heavy work she might need done on the property. It was the kind of neighborly gesture that was common enough on the frontier, where survival was a cooperative enterprise even between people who barely knew each other. She had opened the door of the shack before he finished tying his horse, which told him she had heard him coming and had not been startled. She looked at him with eyes that were gray-green and entirely direct, and she shook his hand with a firm, dry grip that surprised him, and she said, "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Malone. I will let you know if I need the mule." She had not invited him in for coffee. He rode home thinking about those gray-green eyes for longer than he would have admitted to Pete Holly's or anyone else. Over the following weeks, he had found reasons to ride near her fence line with a frequency that Pete had started noting with a poorly concealed grin. He told himself he was watching out for her. She was a woman alone on the frontier, and that was genuinely dangerous in 1882. There were drifters who came up the trail, and the trail itself passed not far east of her land, and the kind of men who rode through Caldwell were not always the kind of men who respected a woman's right to be left alone. But there was more to it than that, and Albert Malone, who prided himself on his honesty even in things that were uncomfortable, knew it. Effie Garner was unlike anyone he had met on the plains. She was competent in a way that was not fragile or performative, just genuinely, quietly capable. Within her first month she had patched the barn wall, cleaned and organized the well, planted a kitchen garden with seeds she must have brought from Wichita, and replaced 2 rotted porch boards with lumber she had somehow negotiated for in town. She was not asking for help. She was not waiting for rescue. She was building something, one deliberate action at a time, and there was something about watching that Albert found he could not look away from. She was also guarded in a way that made his usual directness feel useless. When he rode over, which he did with increasing regularity and increasingly thin pretexts, she was always civil, occasionally warm in a careful, measured way, and never, ever fully open. There was something behind those gray-green eyes that she was holding back, and it bothered him in a way he could not account for except to say that it felt like a door that was shut and latched, and he had not been given permission to knock. He had not yet found out about the strongbox or the deed or Franklin Garner's secret, when things came to a head on that blazing August afternoon, when he rode up her drive for the 4th time in a week, and she met him on the porch with the rifle. But even then, in the moment when she finally lowered it those 2 inches, he felt the shift in the air between them. Something that had been building for 2 months was finally about to crack open, and he could not have said whether that terrified him or relieved him, probably both. "Lower that rifle all the way," he said quietly, "and let me tell you what I know. After that you can point it at me all you like." She brought the Winchester down and rested the butt on the porch railing, but she did not put it down entirely, and she did not step back from the door. She looked at him with that level, measuring gaze and said, "Talk." Albert tied his horse to the fence post and walked to the bottom of her porch steps and stopped there, respecting the distance she was keeping, and told her what he knew. 3 days ago, one of his cowboys, a young man named Daniels who sometimes drank too much and talked too freely, had been in the Drover's Rest Saloon in Caldwell when he overheard a conversation between 2 men Albert recognized. One of them was a land speculator named Cotter Ward, a man with a long history in the county of acquiring property through pressure, fraud, and occasionally more direct methods. The other was a lawyer from Wichita whose name Albert did not know but whose face he had seen before, associated with Ward's dealings. They had been talking about a deed. Specifically, a deed to 12 acres in Sumner County that had been fraudulently filed by a man named Franklin Garner 3 years ago, attaching a mineral rights claim to the land that should have reverted to its prior owner, which was Cotter Ward. Ward believed the deed, and the claim attached to it, was hidden somewhere on the property. He wanted it back because if it fell into the wrong hands or the right hands, it could expose a chain of land fraud stretching across 3 Kansas counties and potentially implicate men of considerable local power. He had told Franklin Garner he wanted it back. Franklin Garner had died before returning it, and now his widow was sitting on the land unknowingly, with that document somewhere in her possession. Effie listened to all of this without moving. When Albert finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "He was not a dishonest man." "I know," Albert said, though he did not know, but he believed it from what he could read of her face. "He must have been pressured into filing it," she said, more to herself than to him. "He would not have done it freely. Franklin was not that kind of person." She looked at Albert directly. "What Cotter Ward did to get my husband to file a fraudulent deed, do you know?" "Not yet," Albert said, "but I intend to find out." She studied him for a moment, and he felt that measuring gaze go all the way through him, assessing not just his words but his character, his motives, the hidden corners of him that he did not often let people see. It was an uncomfortable sensation. It was also, inexplicably, one of the most intimate things he had ever experienced. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. He considered lying or giving a partial truth, which was a kind of lying. He chose not to. "Because I have been riding along your fence line for 2 months and I cannot seem to stop," he said. "And because you are in danger and I would not leave anyone in danger on land next to mine. But mostly the first reason." The silence after that was the longest she had ever given him. "You had better come inside," she finally said. Inside the small house, which she had transformed with breathtaking efficiency into something that felt genuinely lived in and cared for. She put the Winchester in the corner by the door and lit the lamp on the table and went to the cupboard near the window. From behind a flour sack she pulled the strongbox, set it on the table and lifted the lid. Albert sat across from her at the table and looked at what was inside. There were 3 documents. 2 were letters in Franklin Garner's handwriting, dated 2 years ago, addressed to someone whose name had been crossed out so thoroughly that nothing was legible. The 3rd was a land deed, official in form, with a mineral rights addendum attached that bore the seal of the Sumner County Land Office. "I found it 3 nights ago," Effie said. "I had not opened the strongbox since he died. I could not." She paused. "When I finally opened it, I thought at first it might be something innocent. Some piece of business he had forgotten to tell me about. But the letters," Albert said, "the letters make it clear that he was being blackmailed." Her voice was steady, but the steadiness cost her something, he could see that. "I do not know what Ward had over him. The letters do not say specifically. But Franklin was being threatened and he filed this deed under duress. He was trying to protect me." She touched the edge of the paper lightly. "He did not tell me because he was trying to protect me, and in the end it did not matter." Albert read the deed carefully. The mineral rights addendum was the important part. It claimed subsurface rights on the 12 acres and 300 acres adjoining them to the north, which was his land, his M ranch, under a secondary claim that had been filed fraudulently without his knowledge or consent. If Ward had this document and chose to pursue the claim, it could mean legal challenges to Albert's own land title. He sat back and looked at Effie across the small table. "Ward is not just after this to cover his past fraud," he said. "This document gives him grounds to contest the mineral rights on my land as well. There has been oil seepage reported west of here, and if there is oil on these plains, whoever holds the mineral rights to this land is holding something worth a great deal of money." Effie looked at him steadily. "So you have a stake in this beyond wanting to help a neighbor?" "Yes," he said. He had decided honesty was the only thing that worked with her. "My land is at risk too. I want you to know that from the start so there is no misunderstanding about my motives." She looked at him for a moment and something in her face softened just slightly. "I appreciate you saying that. But I also want you to know," Albert said, leaning forward slightly, "is that even if this had no connection to my land, I would still be sitting at this table with you. That is also true." She looked down at the documents and did not respond to that directly, but her hands stilled on the table and there was a quality to the stillness that told him she had heard him. "Cotter Ward is in Caldwell right now," she said. "If he comes here, what do I do?" "You do not open the door alone," Albert said. "And you do not let him know you have found these documents." if he thinks the strongbox is unopened, or even better, if he thinks the documents are not here at all, he will play his hand more slowly. The danger is if he thinks you know what you have and you are planning to use it. Use it how? Against him. He met her eyes. These documents in the right hands could expose the fraudulent filings he has been making across the county for years. The land office in Topeka would be very interested. A lawyer who is not on Ward's payroll would be very interested. The men he has defrauded, and there are several, would be very interested. Effie was quiet for a moment, and he could see the thought forming in her expression before she said it. "You want to use this against him," she said. "Not just to protect our land, you want to expose him. Do you not?" She looked at the strongbox. "He destroyed my husband," she said quietly. "He used Franklin's fear and took his dignity and made him do something against his nature, and then Franklin died carrying that secret alone." Her voice was very calm. "Yes, I want to expose him." Over the next 3 days, Albert barely left Effie's property. He told Pete he was handling a fence line dispute on the south pasture, which was not entirely false given that the fence line was central to the problem, and he spent those days working alongside Effie in a partnership that developed with a speed and naturalness that surprised them both. She was methodical where he was instinctive. He was decisive where she was careful. They balanced each other in ways that became apparent quickly, both of them recognizing it without quite acknowledging it, moving through the shared work of planning and problem-solving with a fluency that felt like something longer established than 3 days. On the first day, they made copies of all 3 documents. Albert had a hand at the ranch who was educated and could copy legal forms with sufficient accuracy. He rode back to the Triple M in the evening, had the copies made, and returned before sunrise with the duplicates. The originals he and Effie decided to hide within the structure of the house itself, behind a false section of wall board that Effie, with her practical ingenuity, identified as already slightly loose and made looser still, concealing the documents in an oilskin wrap. On the second day, they identified their allies. There was a lawyer in Caldwell named Thomas Reed, who Albert knew by reputation to be one of the few legal men in the area who had not at some point taken money from Cotter Ward. Reed was known for handling homesteaders' disputes and had a fierce, terrier-like approach to land law that had made him unpopular with certain wealthy interests in the county, which Albert considered a strong recommendation. There was also the Sumner County Land Office agent in Wellington, the county seat, whose name was Harold Birch and who had, according to what Albert knew through various channels, been suspicious of several filings associated with Ward for years, but lacked the direct evidence to pursue them. On the second evening, when the work of the day was done and they sat on Effie's porch in the cooling air and the sky above the Kansas plain turned the color of a bruise before going dark, she told him more about Franklin. She talked slowly and carefully, choosing her words the way she did most things, deliberately. Franklin had been a gentle person, she said. He had had a kind of goodness in him that was real, not performed, and it had made him vulnerable in the world because not everyone recognized goodness when they saw it, and some people saw it and decided to use it. She believed now that Ward had identified Franklin as the kind of man who could be manipulated through fear, the fear of exposure for something small and perhaps not even truly wrong, some piece of financial irregularity from Franklin's bookkeeping work years ago that Ward had twisted into something threatening. And Franklin, afraid of what exposure would do to Effie, had complied. "He should have told me," Effie said. She was looking at the dark line of the horizon, her voice very quiet. "I would have helped him think of another way, but he believed he was protecting me." "Men do that," Albert said. He meant it gently, but she turned to look at him with a sharpness that told him she caught the gentle criticism within it. "Women do too," she said. "We protect the people we love by carrying things alone. It is not a virtue confined to one sex." "No," he said. "You are right." A small silence settled between them, not uncomfortable. "You have not told me much about yourself," she said then. "No," he agreed. "Are you going to?" He considered the horizon for a moment. My father died when I was 17 and left me and my mother and sister with a farm in Missouri that was too much work for 3 people and not enough income for any of them. I managed for 4 years, and then my sister married and my mother went to live with her, and I took what was left of the inheritance and came west. He paused. I have been here 6 years. This is the first place that has felt like mine. You have no one waiting for you, she said. It was not precisely a question. No, he said. There was a woman in Caldwell 2 years ago briefly. It did not become anything lasting. She wanted Caldwell and I wanted the ranch, and those two things do not easily coexist. Effie nodded slowly. You have given a lot to this land. So have you, he said, in a different way, but it takes the same kind of deciding. She looked at him then, and in the last light he could see her face clearly, the fine lines around her eyes, the set of her jaw, the complicated depth of expression she usually kept controlled. Something in her was relaxing, he realized. Not all the way, not yet, but the door that had been shut and latched for 2 months was moving just slightly on its hinge. I should go in, she said. Tomorrow will be a full day if we are riding to Caldwell. I will be back at first light, he said. He rode home in the dark and could not sleep, and did not try very hard to. They rode into Caldwell the following morning, Effie in the wagon and Albert on horseback alongside her, arriving at Thomas Reed's office before the main street was fully awake. Reed was already at his desk when they knocked, a compact man in his mid-40s with ink-stained fingers and the quick, intelligent eyes of someone who never stopped processing information. He read the copied documents with great care and very little outward expression, and when he finished he sat back in his chair and looked at both of them for a long moment. I have been waiting 7 years for something like this to walk through my door, he said. What can you do with it? Albert asked. A great deal. Reed set the papers down neatly. Ward has been filing fraudulent addenda to land deeds across 4 counties. What he does is identify land with potential mineral or water rights value, find a holder who is vulnerable, usually through debt or personal weakness, and coerce them into filing an addendum that transfers future rights claims to a shell company Ward controls. When the time is right, usually when a railroad or a mining interest comes through, he enforces the addendum and collects. Reed looked at Effie. Your husband was not the first, Mrs. Garner. He was one of perhaps a dozen men Ward has done this to. Effie absorbed this. The other men, are any of them in a position to testify? Reed's eyes sharpened with interest. That is exactly the right question. And yes, 2 of them are, to my knowledge, still in the county and have expressed to me privately over the years that they would act if they had evidence to stand behind. Your husband's documents, combined with the testimony of those 2 men and what I suspect Harold Birch at the land office has been sitting on, would be sufficient to bring Ward before a federal judge. How long would this take? Albert asked. Months, Reed said. To do it properly, through legitimate channels, in a way that sticks and does not give Ward a procedural escape, it will take months. Albert looked at Effie. She was looking at Reed steadily. And in the meantime, she said, Ward is in town and he wants those documents. Yes, Reed said, that is the immediate problem. As long as you are in possession of the original documents, you are a target, and Ward is not a man who limits himself to legal methods. He paused. I would strongly suggest, Mrs. Garner, that you consider whether remaining alone on that property is wise. I am not alone, Effie said, and she did not look at Albert when she said it, but he felt the words settle somewhere in his chest. Reed arranged to write immediately to Harold Birch in Wellington, and to draft a formal complaint to be filed with the Federal Land Office in Topeka, and to contact the 2 men whose testimony he believed could be obtained. He also made a certified copy of the copied documents for his own files, and counseled both Effie and Albert to conduct themselves with complete normalcy in public. Act as if nothing has changed, he said. If Ward is watching, and he will be watching, give him nothing. They left Reed's office and walked out onto Caldwell's Main Street, which was by mid-morning beginning to fill with the usual traffic of a cattle town, wagons and cowboys and merchants, and the general loud, dusty energy of a place that served as the end point of one of the great cattle trails of the era. Caldwell in 1882 was already beginning its transition from purely wild to something slightly more ordered. The railroad had come through the year before, and there was a school now and a proper church, but it retained enough of its original character that a man walking its streets with bad intentions was not necessarily unusual. Albert saw Cotter Ward across the street before Effie did. Ward was a large man, heavy through the shoulders, with a quality of stillness that was not calm but suppressed energy. He was standing outside the General Mercantile with a younger man Albert did not recognize, and he was looking directly at them, at Effie specifically. Albert put a hand at the small of Effie's back, very lightly, just enough to guide her without stopping her stride. "Do not look to the left," he said quietly. "Keep walking." He felt her respond to the contact without stiffening, felt her absorb the information and redirect, moving naturally toward the wagon without altering her pace or her expression. "That was him," she said when they were past. "Yes. He has seen us together." "Yes." She reached the wagon and turned to face him, and her eyes were calm and direct, and he could see the effort behind the calm. "He will think you are involved now." "I am involved," Albert said. "I mean he will think you are a threat. You are not just a neighbor anymore." "Good," Albert said. "I would rather he worry about me than about you." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he was beginning to recognize, a complex, interior thing, assessment and something softer running alongside it, and then she climbed up to the wagon seat and arranged her skirts and picked up the reins. "Come for supper," she said. "I will make something decent for once. You have been eating my biscuits long enough that I owe you a real meal." He mounted his horse and felt something uncomplicated and warm move through him at the ordinary, intimate generosity of that invitation. "I will be there at 6, he said. He was there at 5:30. The weeks that followed were a kind of contained siege and an unexpected unfolding, both things simultaneously, which Effie later thought was entirely appropriate for how the relationship between her and Albert Malone had always operated. Two contradictory things at once, neither canceling the other out. Ward made 2 visits to her property. The first was formal, almost friendly, a tall man with a hat in his hands and a wide, practiced smile, arriving on a Wednesday morning with a proposal that he described as a business arrangement. He had reason to believe, he said, that among her late husband's effects there might be some documents pertaining to a land filing that had been made in error. He would like to retrieve those documents, and in exchange he was prepared to offer her a sum of $200. Effie stood in her doorway and looked at Cotter Ward and felt the specific, clarifying kind of cold hatred that is born not from violence, but from the recognition of what someone has done to people you loved. She smiled at him pleasantly and said that she would have to look through her husband's things carefully as she had not gone through all of them yet, and she would let him know. Ward's smile did not change, but his eyes did. "I would not wait too long, Mrs. Garner. These things have a way of becoming complicated." "I appreciate the warning," she said, and closed the door. She stood on the other side of the closed door and breathed slowly and deliberately until her hands stopped trembling. Albert arrived that afternoon without her sending for him, which told her that he had probably had someone watching for Ward's arrival, and she was not sure whether to be grateful for that or irritated by the assumption, and she settled on grateful because she was an honest person. They talked through the encounter, what Ward had said and how he had said it, and Albert's jaw tightened in a way that she had come to recognize as his controlled version of anger. "He is escalating," Albert said. "The direct offer means he is growing impatient. We have another month, Reed estimates, before the federal filing is complete," Effie said. "A month is a long time." He was pacing her small kitchen, which he did when he was working through a problem, moving with the restless energy of a man who was most comfortable in action. "I want to move the original documents." "Where?" "Reed's office is the safest place in Caldwell. If you allow it, I would rather they were in his safe than behind your wall board." She had thought about this already, actually. Yes, she said, that is sensible. He stopped pacing and looked at her. You thought of it before I suggested it. I did. Why did you not just say so when I walked in? She tilted her head slightly. I was letting you arrive at it independently. People commit to a plan more fully when they believe it was their own idea. He stared at her for a moment, and then something happened that was rare and entirely disarming. He laughed. Not a polite, restrained chuckle, but a genuine, full laugh surprised out of him, and it changed his face completely, broke open the habitual seriousness, and showed her something younger and more unguarded underneath. She felt the response to that in her chest before she could stop it. A warmth that moved through her without warning and settled somewhere behind her sternum and showed every sign of intending to stay. You are the most careful strategist I have ever encountered, he said, when the laughter settled. Franklin always said I should have been a general, she said, and was surprised to find that this mention of Franklin did not carry its usual weight of grief. It felt instead like something she could carry and set down at will. They rode together to Reed's office that evening after dark, with the original documents wrapped in the oilskin and tucked inside Effie's coat. Reed accepted them into his office safe with the gravity of a man who understood exactly what he was holding, and spent the rest of the evening telling them about the history of Ward's frauds with the barely contained enthusiasm of someone whose life's work was about to achieve its purpose. On the ride home, under a sky full of more stars than Effie had ever seen in Wichita, where gas lamps competed with the dark, Albert rode alongside her wagon and they talked about nothing in particular: the quality of the summer, the crops she had managed to get in, the cattle he was moving to the north pasture before the heat peaked, the way the light fell on the prairie in the mornings. Ordinary things. The kind of things people talked about when they were trying to be careful not to talk about the thing they were actually thinking about. Effie, he said, as they turned onto the track that led to her property. Albert, she said, a pause. I'm not good at saying things indirectly. I know, she said. I have noticed that about you. Then I will say it directly. He stopped his horse and she pulled the wagon to a halt and looked at him in the starlight. I have feelings for you that have grown past the point where I can reasonably describe them as neighborly concern or shared strategic interest. I think you know that. I think you may have similar feelings and are choosing not to act on them, which is your right, and I will not press it. But I did not want to continue pretending the situation was something other than what it is. Effie sat very still on the wagon seat. She had had this conversation before. The careful interior negotiation she conducted with herself every time she allowed herself to feel the warmth of Albert's presence, weighed against the practical fact of grief and the complicated question of what she owed to Franklin's memory, and the even more complicated question of what she owed to herself. 7 months a widow, still making sense of who she was outside of a marriage she had entered at 22. You are right that I know, she said finally. And you are right about my feelings. She paused. I am still finding my way through something. I am not asking you to hurry, he said. I just needed you to know I was not pretending. She looked at him for a long moment in the dark. I appreciate that more than you know, she said. She drove the wagon home and put the horses away and sat on her porch alone until the stars began to dim and the east turned gray. And she thought about Albert Malone's face when he laughed and the way he paced her kitchen when he was thinking, and the way he had said her name, Effie, the simplest possible syllables, like it was a word he had been saying for years. Ward's second visit was less friendly. It came on a Saturday evening, late enough that the light was failing, and this time he had 2 men with him, large and quiet in the way of hired muscle rather than cowboy hands. He knocked, which she supposed was something, and when she opened the door he looked at her without the practiced smile this time and said he needed those documents and he needed them now. Effie looked at the 3 men on her porch and said, I told you I have not found anything among my husband's things. I think you are not being truthful with me, Ward said. I think you are standing on my property without an invitation, she said. She was aware, peripherally, of the sound of hooves, and Ward was aware of it too because his attention shifted past her shoulder toward the lane, and when Albert Malone rode up with Pete Hollies and two other Triple M hands behind him, Ward's expression did something complicated and controlled. "Evening," Albert said from horseback with a pleasant, dangerous calm. "Something going on here." Ward looked at Albert and then at Effie and then back at Albert, and whatever calculation he ran behind his eyes concluded in a retreat. "Just a business discussion," Ward said. "We were leaving." He tipped his hat to Effie with a mockery of courtesy and turned and walked back down the drive, his two men behind him, and Effie stood in her doorway and watched them go and felt the specific exhaustion of sustained alertness. Albert swung down from his horse and came up to the porch and looked at her. "You are all right," he said. It was both a question and an assessment. "Yes," she said. "Thank you for the timing." "I had someone watching the road," he said, not apologetically. "I know," she said. "Are you angry?" She considered this seriously. "No," she said. "I would have preferred you ask first, but under the circumstances I am more relieved than anything else." He stood at the bottom of her porch steps, looking up at her, and the last light of the evening was behind him, and there was something in his expression that she recognized now without difficulty, something that had been there for weeks, open and direct and patient in a way that was entirely characteristic of this man who had driven her to frustration and gratitude in approximately equal measure. She stepped down one step, so they were closer to even in height. "Come inside," she said. "I have coffee on the stove." The men rode off, Pete with a poorly concealed grin, and Albert came inside, and they sat at the table she had sat at alone for 2 months, and she poured coffee and they did not talk about Ward or the documents or the legal proceedings in Topeka that Reed had confirmed were now in motion. They talked about Missouri and about grief, and about what it meant to build something from nothing on a piece of land that the wind could take away from you at any moment, and how you did it anyway because the alternative was to let it take you too. They talked until the lamp burned low and the coffee was long gone and the night outside her windows was completely dark and full of the enormous Kansas silence. She walked him to the door, and he turned in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. "I meant what I said the other night," he said. "I know," she said. "And—" She looked at him, this stubborn, honest, infuriating, necessary man, and she felt the grief for Franklin and the loneliness of the past 7 months and the warmth in her chest that had been building since the first time he laughed in her kitchen, and she decided that she had been carrying things alone for long enough. "And I will see you tomorrow," she said. "Come for breakfast." He smiled then, not the surprised, cracked-open laugh of before, but something quieter and more certain, and she thought that smile might be the most dangerous thing she had encountered in all her time on this plane. "I will be here at 7, he said. 6:30, she said. "There is work to do." He was there at 6. The autumn of 1882 arrived on the Kansas plains with an abruptness that always startled people who expected weather to be gradual. One day the heat lay heavy on the land, and the next morning there was frost on the grass, and the sky was the hard, bright blue of a season that had made up its mind. Effie and Albert had by then established a kind of daily rhythm that their respective households had accepted with varying degrees of equanimity. Pete Hollies had given up pretending not to notice and had taken to calling Albert, the South Pasture Inspector, with a dry wit that Albert pretended to find less amusing than he did. Effie's small kitchen had developed a second coffee mug and a spare chair positioned at a particular angle that had become, over 3 months, Albert's chair in a way that no one had declared and everyone understood. What had grown between them was not the blazing thing that Effie had, in her younger years, imagined love must always be. It was something more like a river finding its course, persistent and directional and capable of great force when the conditions required it, but mostly moving with a steadiness that she found, to her own surprise, more deeply satisfying than any imagined passion could have been. He was careful with her grief. He did not pretend Franklin had not existed, or that her 9 years of marriage were something to be quickly papered over. When she spoke of Franklin, he listened without discomfort, and when the specific, ambushing quality of grief sometimes caught her unawares in the middle of ordinary days, he did not try to fix it. He simply stayed near, which turned out to be exactly the right thing. She was, in her turn, careful with his solitude, which she came to understand was something he had chosen as a protection as much as a preference. Albert Malone had learned early that loving things on the frontier was dangerous because the frontier could take them away, and the habit of holding himself slightly separate from full attachment was deep in him. She did not force it. She simply made it clear, through consistency and the particular kind of honesty she practiced, that she was not going anywhere. In October, the legal proceedings began to move with serious momentum. Harold Birch at the Wellington Land Office had been waiting, as Reed had suspected, for exactly this kind of evidence. When the federal filing from Topeka reached him along with the copies of Franklin's documents and Reed's formal complaint, he moved with the efficiency of a man uncorking years of suppressed professional frustration. 2 additional complainants were identified, men who had been defrauded by Ward's scheme in the years before Franklin, and both agreed to provide testimony. Ward, to no one's surprise, retained a lawyer and denied everything. But the evidence, accumulated and formally presented, was a wall he could not find a way around. The proceedings would take the winter. Reed had warned them of that, and it proved accurate. But the Federal Land Office issued a temporary protective order in November that froze all Ward's existing claims, including any claim deriving from the fraudulent deed Franklin had filed. Effie's 12 acres and Albert's M ranch were confirmed as uncontested under their existing titles. The night Reed sent word of the protective order, Albert arrived at Effie's door not with the strategic air of a partner working a problem, but with a bottle of good whiskey he had been keeping for a significant occasion, and the simple, uncomplicated expression of a man who was happy. She opened the door and looked at him and at the whiskey and laughed, and he came inside and they sat together by the small iron stove and drank a measure each and talked quietly about what it meant to have fought for something and seen it begin to be decided in your favor. "It is not over yet," she said. "No," he agreed, "but the worst of it is." She looked at him across the small space, the lamplight warm between them. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what comes after." He was quiet, waiting. "About whether this land is enough on its own, or whether it makes more sense to think about it as part of something larger." She paused. "About what the future looks like." He set down his glass and looked at her directly. "Are you talking about the land or are you talking about us?" "Both," she said. "They are not separate things for me. This land is part of who I am now. Whatever I build here, I want to build it as something real, something permanent." She met his eyes. "I have not been in a position to think about permanence for a long time. I'm starting to be able to." Albert was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was very even, the evenness he used when he was being most careful with something important. "I have been thinking about asking you to marry me," he said. "I have been holding back because I did not want to press you before you were ready. But I want to be honest with you that it is what I want, and that it is not a practical consideration. It is not about the land or the legal proceedings or any of it. It is because you are the person I want to be with. Simply that." Effie looked at him and felt the fullness of the moment, the reality of it, how entirely different it was from any version of this she might have imagined when she had driven a wagon out to 12 acres of Kansas plain with $40 and a steamer trunk and nothing else in the world. "Ask me in the spring," she said. "When the proceedings are finished and everything is settled and we are both standing on solid ground. Ask me then." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. He picked up his glass again. "Spring." They drank to that, and the wind came up outside and the stove put out its steady heat, and outside the stars were cold and enormous, and inside that small house built on 12 acres that belonged to Effie Garner, everything was, for the first time in a very long while, all right. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was a long one. The way Kansas winters are long, not always with the heaviest snowfall or the most dramatic cold, but with a relentless gray duration that presses on people and tests the quality of the warmth they have built against it. Effie spent the winter in a way she had not expected to spend it, not in isolation and endurance, which was how she had anticipated her first winter on the plains when she bought the land in summer, but in a steady, accumulating richness that she recognized, carefully and without rushing it, as contentment. Albert's presence had become as natural as the weather itself. He came most mornings, not always to stay, sometimes just riding south from the Triple M on some legitimate ranch errand that happened to take him past her drive, sometimes stopping for an hour over coffee, sometimes staying through the better part of the day when there was shared work to do, or when the weather pinned them both indoors and conversation became the primary occupation. She learned him thoroughly that winter. The specific vocabulary of his silences, which were not absence of feeling but intense presence of it. The way he held a problem in his mind and rotated it, not speaking until he had thought all the way around it. The particular stubbornness that Pete Hollis had identified correctly as alarming, which could be maddening when directed against her judgment and deeply reassuring when directed on her behalf. His capacity for genuine, uncomplicated enjoyment of small things, a good meal, a clear day, the specific pleasure of completing a piece of work correctly, which she found moving in a man who could easily have been hardened by the difficulty of his chosen life. He learned her too, though she suspected he had started earlier. He had noticed things about her from the beginning that she had not told him, had read in her actions and habits and choices the shape of her history and her nature, and he had the unusual quality of acting on that knowledge with tact rather than using it for advantage. In December, she opened the strongbox one last time, took out the 2 letters in Franklin's handwriting, and read them through from start to finish. She had avoided reading them completely in those first days, had understood enough to know their significance without absorbing every word. Now she read them carefully. Franklin had made a mistake years before Effie came into his life. A financial error in a client's, accounts that he had corrected but not disclosed, and Ward had found it and held it over him with the patient ruthlessness of someone who collected vulnerabilities the way other men collected assets. Franklin had complied with the fraudulent filing not because he was dishonest by nature, but because he was frightened of what exposure might do to Effie, to the life they had built, to his reputation in a world where reputation was the primary capital a bookkeeper possessed. He had, in his own way, tried to fight back. The letters were addressed to a man in Topeka, a contact Franklin had apparently been cultivating, someone in a position to investigate Ward. He had been building a case, slowly and carefully in the way that was his nature, and then he had died before he could complete it. Effie sat with those letters for a long time and felt the complex, textured quality of grief that has moved past its sharpest phase into something that is simply part of the landscape of yourself. Franklin had loved her in his quiet way, had tried to protect her to the limits of his capacity, and had failed, and had died carrying the failure. She could not be angry at him for that. She could only be sorry that he had not trusted her with it while there was still time to carry it together. She put the letters back in the strongbox and put the strongbox on the shelf and went to make supper. And when Albert came by that evening, she told him what she had read, quietly and completely. And he listened without interrupting and without offering to fix what could not be fixed. And when she finished, he simply reached across the table and took her hand and held it for a moment. "He would have been glad to know you are all right," he said. "I think so," she said. "And I think," Albert said carefully, "he would have had something to say about whoever happened to be sitting across the table from his wife." Effie looked at him, surprised, and then laughed genuinely and freely, the kind of laughter that releases something held too tightly for too long. "He would have been polite about it," she said. "He was always very polite." "That sounds like a warning," Albert said. "It is," she said. Be polite." "I am always polite," he said, with the perfectly straight face of a man who is not always polite. The proceedings against Cotter Ward concluded in February of 1883. The federal land court's ruling was comprehensive. Ward was found to have engaged in fraudulent land filings in Sumner, Harper, and Cowley counties, affecting the property rights of 9 landholders. His fraudulent claims were voided. He was ordered to pay restitution to the affected parties and faced criminal charges under federal land fraud statutes that Reed, with considerable satisfaction, had been instrumental in applying. Ward contested the ruling and retained additional counsel and would, by all accounts, spend a significant portion of the coming years in legal battles. But the protective orders on the affected properties were made permanent, and the fraudulent deed with its mineral rights addendum was formally voided and struck from the record. Effie received the formal written notification from the land office in Wellington on a Thursday morning in late February. She read it standing at her kitchen table and then read it again and then walked out onto her porch and stood in the cold morning air and looked at her 12 acres, the brown winter grass, the patched barn, the kitchen garden dormant under its light cover of snow, the fence line running straight and true to the horizon. This was hers. Simply, completely, permanently hers. She heard hooves and looked up, and Albert was coming down the lane on his bay horse, which she suspected meant that Pete or someone had already gotten word from town, because Albert Malone did not miss information that concerned his land or people associated with it. He came to a stop in the yard and looked at the paper in her hand and at her face. "Good news," he said. "Very good news," she said. He swung down and came to the foot of the porch steps and looked up at her, and she thought she had never seen him look quite this way before, open and unguarded, and something else underneath that made her heart move. "It is spring," he said, "or near enough." She looked at him. The February sky above the Kansas plain was hard and clear and blue, and the cold air was sharp with the smell of snow and distance, and she was standing on her own land with the document in her hand that confirmed it would remain so. "It is near enough," she agreed. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and brought out a ring. It was not elaborate, a simple gold band with a small setting of garnets, deep red against the metal, and it caught the winter light. "I had it made in Wellington," he said. "In November. I have been carrying it since November." She looked at the ring and at his face. "You were very certain I would say yes." "No," he said honestly. "I was very certain I wanted to ask. The answer was your business." She came down the porch steps to where he was standing. "Effie Garner," he said, "you have been the most necessary, unexpected, remarkable part of my life for the past 9 months, and I would like very much to be necessary to yours permanently. Will you marry me?" She looked at him for exactly as long as it took to confirm that she was entirely certain, which was not long at all. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it there. Red garnets on gold on the hand that had driven a wagon alone across the Kansas plains, and held a rifle on this man, and planted a kitchen garden from seed, and built something from nothing on a piece of land that had seemed like all she had left. She looked up at him and he looked at her, and then his arms came around her and she let him hold her, properly and completely for the first time, her face against his chest and his heartbeat steady under her ear. And the Kansas wind moved across the plains, and over the 12 acres that were hers, that would always be hers, and over the 360 acres of the Triple M ranch to the north, and over everything they had built and everything they were going to build. They were married in April, in the small white Methodist church in Caldwell that had been standing for 3 years and smelled of new lumber and beeswax candles. Thomas Reed stood for Albert. A woman named Clara Beaumont, old Mrs. Beaumont's daughter who had come to visit and decided to stay, stood for Effie. Pete Hollis sat in the front pew with his hat on his knee and the expression of a man who had been right about something and was too dignified to say so. The ceremony was simple, and the reception was held in the Caldwell Town Hall, a celebration that drew more people than Effie had expected, because Albert Malone had been in this county for 6 years and had earned a great deal of quiet respect that he had never particularly sought, and because Effie, in the 9 months she had been in Sumner County, had made the kind of impression that people paid attention to on the frontier, the impression of someone worth knowing. She wore a dress of deep blue wool, which was practical and also beautiful, and she carried no flowers because it was April in Kansas, and the prairie wildflowers were just beginning. Albert stood at the altar in his best coat and looked at her when she came down the aisle with the look she had come to know as his most honest face, the one without strategy or guard, simply present, simply himself. She took his hand at the altar, and the minister began the words, and she thought, in the way the mind does unexpected things at significant moments, about how 9 months ago she had driven a wagon alone to a shack on 12 acres with $40 and nothing but her own determination, and about how the life you build from nothing is the life that is most entirely yours. She thought about Franklin, who would have been, she now believed, quietly glad for her. She thought about the 12 acres adjoining 360, and the fence line between them that would, in practical terms, soon become somewhat academic. She thought about Albert's hand in hers, and how it felt like something she had been looking for without knowing she was looking for it. "I do," she said, clearly and without hesitation. They settled into the life of the combined ranch with the same practical efficiency that had characterized their working partnership from the beginning. But the life of the ranch was not only efficient, it was full. Albert formalized the addition of Effie's 12 acres to the Triple M's operation, not by absorbing them, not by erasing what she had built, but by treating them as what they were, the original purchase from which everything else grew. The small house remained, and she kept her kitchen garden there, and the barn was properly repaired and used as secondary storage. The fence line between the two properties came down in the places where it made practical sense, but the deed to the 12 acres remained in her name, and Albert had, without her asking, insisted on this. "That land is what you came here with," he said. "It stays yours." She had loved him already by then. This made her love him more. Effie took over the account keeping for the Triple M Ranch, a natural evolution that Pete Holly's embraced with the relief of a man who had been managing numbers that were not his particular strength. She reorganized the ranch's financial records with the meticulous accuracy she had developed helping Franklin, and what she found gave her a clear picture of an operation that was sound, but could be significantly more profitable with some restructuring of the cattle buying cycles, and a shift in how they handled the Caldwell market. She presented her analysis to Albert on a Tuesday evening in June, 3 months after their wedding, sitting at the table in the main ranch house over papers spread between the coffee cups. He read through everything she had prepared with the thorough attention he gave to things that mattered, and when he finished he looked up at her and said, "When did you do all this?" "Over the past 6 weeks," she said. "In the mornings before you came in from the east pasture. You have been sitting here at 5 in the morning running my cattle numbers." "Our cattle numbers," she said. He looked at her with that expression she loved, the one that was simultaneously surprised and entirely unsurprised, as though she was constantly exceeding his expectations in ways that were completely consistent with everything he already knew about her. "Our cattle numbers," he agreed, "which, based on this, I have been mismanaging for approximately 4 years. "Not mismanaging," she said, "just managing with incomplete information. You are being generous." "I am being accurate," she said. "There is a difference." He reached across the papers and found her hand. "Effie Malone," he said. "I would have struggled alone on this ranch for another 20 years and done reasonably well and never known what I was missing." She looked at their joined hands on the papers that represented everything they were building together. "Same," she said softly. The summer and fall of 1883 brought the confirmation of something Effie had suspected since late August, that the next generation of Malones was on its way. She told Albert on a September morning when the plains were still warm, and the kitchen was full of the smell of the apple preserves she had put up from the small trees she had planted along the south fence. He was at the table with his coffee, and she came in from the garden and sat across from him and said, simply, "We are going to have a child." The look on his face was one she kept with her always afterwards, a complete, unguarded joy, the kind that does not arrange itself into dignity or composure because it does not have time. It simply arrives fully formed and takes over everything. He came around the table and knelt beside her chair and took both her hands and looked at her. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said. "Yes," she said, "very well." He pressed his lips to her hands and she felt the warmth of it move through her. And outside, through the kitchen window, the September plain stretched golden to the horizon. And everything was held in that moment, the 12 acres and the 360, and the life built from nothing, and the man kneeling beside her, and the future already begun. In the spring of 1884, on a night when the Kansas wind came down warm from the north for the first time since autumn and the prairie grass was greening, Effie gave birth to a son. They named him Franklin Albert Malone, and Albert held him in the lamplight of the bedroom with the absolute, concentrated care of a man holding the most important thing he had ever held. And Effie watched her husband hold their son, and felt the particular, overwhelming quality of a happiness so complete, it is almost difficult to contain. Franklin Albert Malone was dark-haired like his father and had his mother's gray-green eyes, and from the first week of his life, he had an air of deliberate, watchful attention that Pete Hollis declared, with great certainty, was entirely from Effie's side. Albert accepted this without argument, which was unusual for him, and Effie suspected it was because he secretly agreed. The legal proceedings against Cotter Ward concluded definitively in late 1883, with Ward accepting a settlement that included significant financial penalties and the permanent revocation of the fraudulent claims. He left Sumner County and was not missed. Thomas Reed attended a small celebratory dinner at the Malone Ranch and toasted Effie as the person who had, in his view, made the whole thing possible. Without Mrs. Garner keeping her head when a lesser person would have either sold those documents or been intimidated into silence, Reed said, raising his glass, none of this would have happened. Effie raised her own glass and said, "And without a very stubborn rancher who could not seem to stay away from my fence line." Albert, beside her, said nothing, but the look he gave her was so warm that Clara Beaumont, sitting across the table, sighed visibly. The years that followed were the years of building. Effie's account reorganization proved as profitable as her analysis had projected, and by 1885, the Triple M was the most efficiently run cattle operation in Sumner County, with a reputation that had spread to the Caldwell market and beyond. They expanded the herd carefully, not rushing, not over-leveraging, following the methodical pace that Effie had proposed, and Albert had committed to with the same wholehearted conviction he applied to everything he decided on. They hired 2 more hands and eventually a dedicated cook for the ranch, which Effie advocated for not because she was unwilling to cook, but because her time was more valuably spent on the account books, and she was entirely comfortable saying so. Albert agreed with a promptness that made Pete Hollis raise his eyebrows. Little Franklin, who everyone quickly began calling Frank, grew into a boy with his mother's precision and his father's physical ease, equally comfortable on horseback and sitting at the kitchen table working through arithmetic with a focus that made Effie feel a quiet, deep pleasure. She taught him herself through his early years, using the curricula she had ordered from a publishing house in St. Louis, and when the Caldwell School added an upper-level program she enrolled him there with the confidence of a mother who knew her child was prepared. In 1886, their second child arrived, a girl they named Clara Malone, after Clara Beaumont, who had remained in Caldwell and had become one of Effie's closest friends, and after Albert's mother, whose middle name had been Me. Clara came into the world with a volume and a certainty that suggested she had opinions from the very first moment, and intended to share them, which delighted Albert and made Pete Hollis say that the ranch was now fully outnumbered by the Malone temperament in its most concentrated form. By 1887, 5 years after Effie had driven a wagon to a shack on 12 acres with nothing but $40 and her own determination, the Triple M Ranch comprised just over 400 acres, a sound herd, a well-maintained house that had been extended twice, a kitchen garden that was the envy of every woman in the county, 2 children who were loud and healthy and loved, and a marriage that had grown over those years into the kind of thing that becomes the axis around which everything else turns. Albert said to Effie, one evening in the late summer of 1887, when the children were asleep and they were sitting on the porch of the main house in the cooling air, watching the last light leave the sky, "I have been trying to think of when it was that I knew with absolute certainty." "Knew what?" she asked, though she knew what he meant. "That I was not going to stop, that I was going to keep coming back to that fence line no matter what reason I invented." She thought about it. "When?" "The first morning I came over with the pretense of the mule," he said. "You shook my hand. Most women on the frontier would have been at least somewhat deferential, or at least performed a version of it. You just shook my hand and looked at me like I was a person to be assessed and you had not yet reached a conclusion," she laughed. "And that was what decided you." "I thought about it all the way home," he said, "and then I could not stop thinking about it." She leaned back in her chair and looked at the darkening sky. "For me it was when you laughed in my kitchen," she said. "You had been so relentlessly serious and careful and strategic, and then I said something that surprised you and you laughed properly, and I saw who you actually were underneath all the management." He turned his head to look at her. "And what did you see?" She considered him in the fading light, this man who had come back along her fence line again and again, until she had finally, in her own time and on her own terms, let him in, who had stood beside her through the worst of what her inherited trouble had brought, and had been honest with her at every step, who had held their son with trembling hands and their daughter with a fearlessness that had surprised him as much as anyone, who had built something alongside her that was larger and more alive than either of them could have built alone. "Someone I was going to love," she said simply. He reached across the gap between their chairs and found her hand, and they sat together while the Kansas stars appeared one by one above the plains, above the 12 acres that had started everything, above the fence line that had once been the boundary between their lives and was now just a line in the grass. And the wind moved over all of it as it always had, as it always would. In the spring of 1888, Thomas Reed wrote to tell them that a young woman in Caldwell had come to him, with a situation not unlike the one he had first handled for Effie. A widow with property and documents she did not understand, and a man of questionable intent making her feel trapped. Reed had thought of Effie immediately and wrote asking whether she might be willing to speak with the woman. Effie wrote back the same day. "Yes. Send her out." The woman's name was Anna Pearson. She was 28, and she arrived at the Triple M in a hired wagon with the careful, controlled composure of someone who had been managing alone for long enough that composure had become their primary skill. Effie recognized this immediately, and with the specific recognition of someone who had once possessed the exact same armor. She brought Anna into the kitchen and made coffee and listened to the whole story without interrupting, and when it was done she said, "You are not in this alone. Let us start from the beginning and work through it." Albert, who had come in from the north pasture and was standing in the kitchen doorway, heard these words and looked at his wife and felt the warmth he had been feeling for 6 years settle into the particular, permanent quality it had taken on over that time. He poured himself a coffee and sat down at the table. "I know a lawyer in Caldwell," he said to Anna Pearson, "who is very good at this kind of problem." The three of them sat around the kitchen table, Effie and Albert, and this new person who needed what this place had to offer. And outside the spring Kansas wind was warm, and the prairie grass was the same vivid, startling green it had been on the morning Effie first stood on her small porch and looked at the flat horizon and thought, "This is mine." Frank was in the yard building something from scrap lumber with the focused intensity of a 6-year-old who has decided on a project. Clara, not yet 2, was asleep upstairs with a directness that suggested she had decided napping was acceptable for today, but reserved the right to reconsider tomorrow. The kitchen smelled of coffee and the early garden coming in through the open window, and the sound of the ranch moved around them, horses and wind, and the distant call of a hand across the south pasture. This was what Effie Garner had built from 12 acres and a strongbox, and the refusal to be frightened into surrender. This was what Albert Malone had kept coming back to, time after time, until the distance between them collapsed into the simple fact of 2 people who were better together than apart. This was the life, and it was whole and it was theirs. Later that evening, when Anna Pearson had gone back to Caldwell with Reed's name written on a piece of paper and considerably less fear in her eyes than she had arrived with, and Frank had been called in from the yard and fed and eventually herded, protesting, to bed, and Clara had woken from her nap and demanded attention with the volume that was her particular specialty, and then finally, consented to sleep again, Effie and Albert stood together in the kitchen in the quiet. He was drying the supper dishes while she washed them, a domestic arrangement that Pete Hollis would have considered deeply improbable for the man he had known 6 years ago, and Albert considered simply as the way things were and always had been between himself and Effie, a partnership in the fullest sense, in the large things and the small ones. "Another child," she said. She said it quietly, looking at the dish in her hands. He went still. She turned and looked at him, and her face held the same careful, interior expression she had worn on the September morning 4 years ago when she had come in from the apple trees, and he felt the same complete, unguarded joy he had felt then arrive before he could organize it. "Are you certain?" he said. "Not entirely yet," she said, "but fairly certain." He set down the dish towel and came to her and took her hands, the same way he had knelt beside her chair in the September kitchen of 1883, and looked at her, and the years between that moment and this one were all there in the space between them. The rifle on the porch and the strongbox and the legal papers and the porch evenings and the laughter and the grief and the building. All of it, every day of it. "Whatever this is," he said, "whatever it becomes, I want you to know that you are the reason all of it means anything." She looked at him, this entirely known, entirely beloved, entirely necessary person. "I know," she said. "You are the reason, too." Outside, the Kansas plain lay under the spring night, enormous and dark, and full of the specific silence that is not empty but full of everything that lives within it. The 12 acres and the Triple M stretched together under the stars, unbroken, whole. And inside the warm kitchen, with the lamp burning low and the sound of their children breathing in the rooms above, Effie and Albert Malone held on to each other and were home.